At the turn of the 20th century, Argentina was not a struggling developing nation. It was a destination. Immigrants from Spain, Italy, and Eastern Europe were sailing not toward the United States, they were sailing toward Buenos Aires. Argentina had the 8th highest GDP per capita on Earth. It exported more beef and grain than almost anyone. Its capital city was being called the Paris of South America. Its rail network stretched across an entire continent, and its trajectory pointed straight up. So here is the question that has puzzled economists, historians, and policymakers for over a century. How does a country with that kind of head start end up defaulting on its debt 9 times? How does a nation that once outpaced Germany, France, and Canada in per capita income eventually become a place where annual inflation regularly exceeds 100%, where ordinary people wake up every morning knowing their savings are worth less than they were the night before? This is not a story about a country that never had a chance. This is a story about a country that had every chance and what happened instead. To understand the collapse, you have to understand the inheritance. Argentina entered the 20th century with a geography that most nations can only dream about. The Pampas, that vast, flat, fertile interior, is one of the most productive agricultural zones on the planet. The soil practically grew wealth on its own. Cattle ranching and wheat farming made Argentina the breadbasket of the Southern Hemisphere. British capital poured in to build the railroads that connected the interior to the ports. The ports connected Argentina to the world. The oligarchy that ran the country, a small class of landowners known as the estancieros, got extraordinarily rich. And for a while, that wealth trickled outward. Cities grew. A middle class emerged. Education expanded. Buenos Aires began to look and feel like a European capital transplanted to the Southern Hemisphere. But beneath the prosperity, a structural problem was already embedded in the foundation. The economy was not being built, it was being extracted. Argentina was exporting raw materials and importing finished goods. The wealth was real, but it was concentrated, fragile, and entirely dependent on international commodity prices that Argentina had no power to control. When the world wanted beef and grain, Argentina thrived. When the world stopped buying or found cheaper suppliers, Argentina had no manufacturing base, no industrial buffer, nothing to fall back on. That vulnerability would define everything that followed. The first real fracture came in 1930. The global depression had gutted commodity demand. Argentina's export revenues collapsed. The landed elite panicked. And the military, deciding that democracy was an inconvenient obstacle, staged a coup. It was the first of many. For the next several decades, Argentina lived inside a pattern that became almost ritualistic: civilian government, economic instability, military intervention, return to civilian rule, more instability, another coup. The cycle repeated itself with exhausting regularity, and each revolution through the wheel left the institutions weaker and the public more cynical. Then came Juan Perón. In 1946, Perón rose to power on a wave of genuine popular support. He was charismatic, nationalist, and he spoke directly to the working class, the descamisados, the shirtless ones, in a way Argentine politics had never quite done before. He built unions. He raised wages. He expanded social programs. Alongside him stood his wife Eva, who became something close to a saint in the eyes of Argentina's poor. And for a moment, it looked like it might work. But Perón financed his program by nationalizing industries, printing money, and spending reserves that Argentina had accumulated during the Second World War. He built a political machine that rewarded loyalty and punished opposition. He subordinated economic policy to political popularity. And when commodity prices fell again in the early 1950s and the reserves ran dry, the whole apparatus began to crack. Perón was eventually overthrown in 1955. But Peronism, the movement, the ideology, The deep emotional attachment of millions of Argentines could not be overthrown. It simply went underground. And then it came back, again and again, in different forms, carried by different people, always promising the same thing: the state as protector, spending as solidarity, and nationalism as identity. That promise would prove extraordinarily difficult to escape. Here is the mechanism that explains most of what followed. Argentina developed a political economy where the cost of winning an election was making promises that the country could not afford to keep, and the cost of breaking those promises was losing power, or worse. So, politicians kept making them. Wages got indexed to inflation. Inflation rose. Wages got indexed again. A spiral locked into place that was almost impossible to break without inflicting severe short-term pain on the exact voters who had to approve of you surviving politically. State-owned enterprises hemorrhaged money but employed millions of loyal workers. Subsidies ballooned because removing them meant riots. And when revenues fell short, which they perpetually did, the government turned to the one tool it always had available: the printing press. Argentina printed pesos to cover deficits. More pesos chased the same goods. Prices rose. People lost faith in the currency. They converted pesos to dollars as fast as they could. The peso weakened further. Prices rose again. The government printed more pesos to cover the new shortfall. This is not a theory. This is what happened, repeatedly, with different leaders, different parties, different ideological justifications. The mechanism was identical every single time. By the early 1980s, inflation was running at several 100% annually. By the late 1980s, under President Alfonsín, it crossed 3,000%. The economy wasn't just struggling, it was dissolving. Supermarkets changed price tags multiple times per day. Workers rushed to spend their paychecks within hours of receiving them because the money would be worth less by evening. In 1991, Argentina tried something radical. The convertibility plan, engineered by economics minister Domingo Cavallo, pegged the Argentine peso 1-to-1 with the US dollar. It was a drastic constraint, essentially surrendering the ability to print money freely, because every peso in circulation now had to be backed by a dollar in reserve. And for almost a decade, it worked spectacularly. Inflation collapsed, the economy grew, foreign investment flooded in, confidence returned. Argentines, who had spent years watching their savings evaporate, could suddenly hold a currency that held its value. The middle class expanded. Buenos Aires felt prosperous again. But the convertibility plan contained a fatal structural flaw that was visible to anyone willing to look. If Argentina couldn't devalue its currency, it couldn't make its exports cheaper when the global economy shifted. And in the late 1990s, the global economy shifted. Brazil, Argentina's largest trading partner, devalued its currency. The US dollar, to which the peso was now rigidly tied, surged in value. Argentine exports became expensive. Competitiveness collapsed. The government, unable to devalue, tried to achieve the same effect by cutting wages and government spending, what economists call internal devaluation. Which means, instead of making the currency cheaper, you make the people poorer. The recession deepened. Unemployment climbed. The government borrowed heavily to maintain the peg and fund its obligations. Debt mounted. And when markets began to doubt whether Argentina could service that debt, borrowing became more expensive, which made the debt problem worse, which made markets more skeptical. The spiral ran in reverse this time, but it ran just as fast. December 2001. The government, watching reserves drain at an alarming pace, froze bank accounts. Argentines woke up to find they could not access their own savings. The restriction was called the corralito, the little corral, a fence around your own money. The streets erupted. Protests turned violent. The death toll reached dozens. 5 presidents cycled through power in a single week. And then the government did what the convertibility plan had been built to prevent. It defaulted on approximately $100 billion in sovereign debt. At the time, the largest sovereign default in history, the peso, once worth $1, collapsed to roughly 3 cents on the exchange rate within months. Savings denominated in pesos lost most of their value overnight. The middle class, a generation of Argentines who had worked their entire lives, followed the rules, saved carefully, watched decades of accumulated wealth simply disappear. The human cost was staggering and largely invisible in the global financial press, which focused mostly on the technical dimensions of the default and the IMF negotiations. But in Argentina, the 2001 crisis permanently altered something in the national psyche. Trust in banks, in currency, in institutions, in government did not just erode. For many, it shattered completely. What happened next is where Argentina's story gets genuinely complicated. The economy recovered. Quickly, actually faster than most expected. Commodity prices surged in the early 2000s as China's appetite for soybeans and beef drove Argentine export revenues back up. The government, under Nestor Kirchner and later Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, rebuilt growth, reduced poverty, and renegotiated the defaulted debt. But the structural patterns reasserted themselves. Subsidies expanded massively, state spending climbed, inflation was officially reported at numbers that independent economists and eventually the IMF concluded were fabricated. When a private economist published inflation data that contradicted the government's figures, he was fined. The official statistics agency was accused of producing whatever numbers were politically convenient. The currency controls came back. The dollar became rationed. A parallel black market exchange rate, the blue dollar, emerged, trading at multiples of the official rate. Argentines, deeply experienced in the psychology of currency instability, found ways around every restriction because they had learned through repeated experience that the official rate was fiction. When commodity prices softened again in the 2010s, the revenues that had masked the underlying imbalances disappeared. The deficits returned. The printing resumed. And inflation climbed back toward triple digits. By 2023, Argentina's annual inflation rate had exceeded 100%. The peso had lost most of its purchasing power against the dollar over just a few years. A substantial portion of the population lived in poverty. And Argentine voters, in a moment that stunned much of the world, elected Javier Milei, a libertarian economist who appeared on television with a chainsaw, promising to cut the state to its foundations. Whether that experiment succeeds or fails, it reflects something important. After more than a century of alternating between nationalist expansion and austerity crisis, between printing money and borrowing dollars, between populism and technocracy, Argentina's population had run out of patience for moderate solutions. They wanted something different, even if different was extreme. So what actually went wrong? The honest answer is that Argentina's collapse was not the result of one bad decision. It was the result of a political system that repeatedly chose short-term stability over long-term structural repair. Spending that bought loyalty, printing that bought time, defaults that reset the clock without fixing the clock's mechanism. The agricultural wealth was real. The human capital was real. The infrastructure was real. But wealth that is extracted rather than built creates political structures that are oriented toward distribution rather than production. And in those structures, the incentives for any individual politician to impose necessary pain are always overwhelmed by the incentives to promise relief instead. Every country faces that tension. Most manage it imperfectly. Argentina managed it catastrophically, not because its people were uniquely foolish or corrupt, but because the particular combination of its history, its inequality, its commodity dependence, and its institutional fragility made the catastrophic outcome the path of least resistance, decade after decade. The lesson that Argentina offers is not comfortable. It is not that populism is always wrong, or that austerity is always right, or that any particular ideology is the villain of this story. The lesson is narrower, and in some ways more unsettling. Institutional trust is extraordinarily difficult to build, and remarkably easy to destroy. A currency is not just a medium of exchange, it is a promise, backed by confidence in the entity making the promise. When that confidence breaks, rebuilding it requires years of painful discipline that democratic systems find almost impossible to sustain. Argentina is not a cautionary tale about what happens to countries that fail to modernize. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when the gap between what a political system promises and what an economy can deliver becomes too wide to paper over, and the only tool left is the printing press. The presses ran, the gap widened, and one of the world's most promising economies became one of its most enduring puzzles. The question that remains is whether the next chapter is genuinely different or whether Argentina is simply at the beginning of another cycle that its people have lived through so many times they can almost set their clocks by it.